Small bell above the diner door chimed as Grace wiped down table 12 for the third time that evening, her cloth moving in practiced circles across the worn formica surface. 23 years old and already carrying the weight of responsibility that seemed to age her beyond her years. She moved through Mario's family restaurant with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that invisibility was often safer than being noticed. The lunch rush had ended hours ago, leaving behind the usual scattered customers nursing cold coffee and the lingering smell of grease that clung to everything in the small establishment. Grace tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, the simple gesture revealing the small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd gotten during her own family's desperate journey across the border 8 years earlier. Few people bothered to look closely enough to notice such details about their waitress, which suited her just fine. She preferred to observe rather than be observed, a habit born from years of learning to read rooms and situations with the keen awareness that survival often depended on understanding the mood of strangers. The restaurant owner, Mario Castellanos, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of clean glasses, his stocky frame moving with the hurried energy of someone perpetually behind schedule. He'd hired Grace partly out of sympathy for her story and partly because she worked harder than anyone else he'd ever employed, never calling in sick and never complaining about the difficult customers or the long hours on her feet. What he didn't know was that Grace spoke 4 languages fluently and had been studying pre-med before her family's circumstances forced her to abandon her education and focus on immediate survival. The dinner crowd would arrive soon, bringing with it the usual mix of local families, truckers passing through, and the occasional business person who'd wandered in from the nearby office complex. Grace had learned to read them all, adjusting her approach to maximize tips while avoiding the wandering hands and inappropriate comments that seemed to be an occupational hazard. She'd developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs, refill coffee cups before they emptied, and navigate the complex social dynamics that played out over shared meals. Her co-worker Jennifer breezed past carrying a pot of coffee, her blonde ponytail swinging as she chatted animatedly with a customer about weekend plans. At 19, Jennifer still possessed the easy confidence of someone who'd never known real hunger or the hollow fear of not knowing where next month's rent would come from. Grace didn't resent her for it, but she sometimes envied the lightness with which Jennifer moved through the world, unburdened by the constant mental calculations of cost and consequence that had become second nature to Grace. The restaurant's atmosphere shifted subtly as the evening light began to fade outside the large windows that faced the main street. Grace had noticed that certain times of day brought different energies, different customers, different challenges. She'd also learned to trust her instincts about people, a skill honed by years of navigating situations where misreading someone's intentions could have serious consequences. Tonight felt different somehow, charged with a tension she couldn't quite identify, but that made her more alert than usual. Dr. Richard Hayes sat in the corner booth, his expensive suit slightly rumpled from a long day of meetings at the medical center across town. Grace had served him several times over the past month, noting his habit of working through dinner while making phone calls that seemed to involve large sums of money and complex logistical arrangements. He was polite, but distant, the kind of customer who barely registered her presence beyond her function as someone who brought food and refilled drinks. She'd overheard enough of his conversations to know he was involved in some kind of charitable organization, though the details remained unclear. Mario had been increasingly stressed lately about the restaurant's finances, and Grace could see it in the way he counted the till multiple times each night, and the careful way he portioned ingredients in the kitchen. The small restaurant served a diverse community, but it competed with chain establishments that could offer cheaper prices and flashier amenities. Grace understood that her job security depended partly on the restaurant's survival, which meant every customer mattered. Every order counted and every interaction could potentially impact their collective future. The bell chimed again, and Grace looked up from her cleaning to see a young woman enter hesitantly, an infant strapped to her chest in a worn fabric carrier. The woman's clothes were clean but clearly well used, and she carried herself with the particular combination of exhaustion and hypervigilance that Grace recognized immediately. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes moved constantly, taking in exits and assessing potential threats with the automatic awareness of someone whose safety had never been guaranteed. Grace felt something tighten in her chest as she watched the woman approach the hostess station where Jennifer stood organizing menus. The infant appeared to be sleeping, its tiny face barely visible above the carrier's fabric, but Grace could see the tension in the mother's shoulders and the careful way she moved, as if every step required conscious effort. There was something about the scene that made Grace pause in her cleaning, her cloth stopping mid-motion as she focused on the interaction unfolding across the restaurant. Jennifer's bright smile faltered slightly as she took in the woman's appearance, her eyes moving from the shabby clothes to the baby carrier and back again. Grace couldn't hear the conversation from her position across the dining room, but she could read body language well enough to understand that something was wrong. The woman was speaking in what sounded like Spanish, though Grace caught hints of another language underneath, and Jennifer's expression grew increasingly confused and slightly annoyed. The other customers began to notice the disturbance, conversations pausing as people turned to observe the scene at the front of the restaurant. Grace recognized the shift in atmosphere. The wait curiosity mixed with judgment and discomfort when faced with someone who didn't fit their expectations of who belonged in their space. She'd been on the receiving end of such scrutiny enough times to understand both its power and its cruelty, and she felt her heart rate increase as she watched the situation develop. Grace moved closer to the front of the restaurant, ostensibly to wipe down an already clean table, but really to better understand what was happening. The young mother was pointing to the menu board above the counter, her words coming faster now with what Grace recognized as increasing desperation. Jennifer kept shaking her head, clearly out of her depth, and growing more flustered by the minute. The baby stirred in its carrier, making small sounds that suggested it would wake soon and likely be hungry. From her new position, Grace could hear fragments of the conversation and immediately understood the problem. The woman was asking about food prices, but more than that, she was trying to explain something about money, about needing help, about her baby. Jennifer's limited high school Spanish wasn't sufficient for this conversation, and her discomfort was becoming more apparent with each passing moment. Grace noticed how the woman's hands shook slightly as she reached into a small purse, counting coins with the careful precision of someone for whom every penny mattered desperately. Mario emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the commotion, and Grace watched his expression shift from confusion to concern, to something harder as he assessed the situation. She'd seen that look before when customers couldn't pay their bills, or when local teenagers tried to loiter without ordering. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it was the look of a business owner protecting his establishment from potential problems. Grace understood his position even as her heart went out to the young mother who was clearly in crisis. Dr. Hayes looked up from his phone call, his conversation pausing as he observed the scene unfolding near the entrance. Grace noticed his expression change from mild annoyance at the interruption to something more focused as he studied the young woman and her baby. His business call apparently forgotten, he set his phone down on the table and leaned forward slightly, his attention fully captured by whatever he was witnessing. The baby began to cry, a thin, hungry sound that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise like a knife. Grace felt the sound in her bones, remembering her own infant sister's cries during their family's most desperate moments years ago. The young mother tried to soothe the child, while simultaneously attempting to communicate with Jennifer and Mario. Her stress level obviously rising as more people in the restaurant turned to stare at the disturbance she was inadvertently creating. Grace could see the exact moment when the woman realized she was becoming a spectacle. Her shoulders drew together protectively, and she began backing toward the door while making apologetic gestures. Grace recognized the body language of someone preparing to flee, to give up on whatever desperate plan had brought her to this place. The baby's cries grew louder, and Grace noticed how several customers were beginning to mutter complaints about the noise and disruption. Jennifer looked helplessly between Mario and the retreating mother, clearly relieved that the confusing encounter was ending, but also uncertain whether she'd handled it correctly. Mario's expression softened slightly as he watched the woman struggle, but Grace could see him weighing compassion against practical concerns. The dinner rush would begin soon, and upset customers could spread negative word of mouth that a small restaurant couldn't afford. Two middle-aged women at table 6 were whispering to each other, their disapproving glances making it clear they felt the young mother had no business bringing her problems into their peaceful dining experience. Grace felt a familiar anger rise in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when witnessing the casual cruelty that people could display toward those they perceived as different or desperate. She learned to suppress such feelings in order to keep her job. But something about this situation made her usual professional detachment more difficult to maintain. The young mother reached the door and paused there, looking back once more at the menu board with an expression that mixed longing with resignation. Grace could practically read her thoughts, could see her calculating whether she had enough money for even the cheapest item, whether it would be enough to sustain her and feed her baby, whether the risk of further humiliation was worth the chance of getting help. Grace made a decision that surprised even her. Setting down her cleaning cloth, she walked purposefully toward the front of the restaurant, her movement drawing curious glances from other customers. Mario looked at her questioningly, but she didn't meet his eyes, focused instead on reaching the young woman before she disappeared through the door. Grace had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, but something about this moment demanded that she step into the light. Dr. Hayes had completely abandoned his phone call now, his full attention focused on the drama playing out before him. Grace noticed him shift in his seat, as if preparing to intervene somehow, but she was already moving, already committed to a course of action that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The baby's cries seemed to grow more urgent, and Grace could see exhaustion weighing down the mother's every movement. As Grace approached, she could see the young woman more clearly. Despite her obvious fatigue and stress, there was an intelligence in her eyes, a dignity that poverty and desperation couldn't erase. Grace recognized something of herself in this stranger, remembered the feeling of standing on the outside of normalcy, hoping for kindness but expecting rejection. The recognition made her move faster, made her more determined to bridge the gap between them before the opportunity was lost forever. The young mother's hand was already on the door handle when Grace reached her, speaking softly in Spanish to avoid drawing more attention from the other customers. The woman's eyes widened with surprise and relief at hearing her native language, and Grace could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Through their quiet conversation, Grace learned that the woman's name was Elena, that she was 19 years old, and that she'd been traveling for 3 days with her 6-month-old daughter, surviving on the few dollars she'd managed to save. Elena explained in rapid, whispered Spanish that she'd been hoping to buy something small to eat and to ask if she could feed her baby somewhere private. She'd been nursing, but her own inadequate nutrition was affecting her milk supply, and the baby hadn't eaten properly in over 12 hours. Grace felt her stomach clench as she absorbed this information, remembering her own family's hungry days and the particular desperation that came with being responsible for someone more vulnerable than yourself. Mario approached them, his expression a mixture of sympathy and business concern. Grace quickly translated Elena's situation, watching her boss wrestle with competing impulses. She could see him calculating the cost of a meal against the potential problems of encouraging homeless people to see his restaurant as a source of free food. It was a calculation she understood, but that felt inadequate to address the human crisis standing before them. Jennifer hovered nearby, looking uncomfortable with the extended drama and clearly wanting to return to her normal duties. Grace noticed other customers beginning to show signs of impatience, checking their watches and looking toward the kitchen as if wondering where normal service would resume. The baby's cries had subsided into intermittent whimpers, but Elena's distress was becoming more apparent as she struggled to maintain composure while explaining her situation. Dr. Hayes had abandoned all pretense of working and was now openly watching the interaction, though from his distance across the restaurant. Grace doubted he could understand the Spanish conversation. Something in his expression suggested he was beginning to piece together the nature of the crises, and Grace noticed him reach for his wallet, as if considering some form of intervention. The dinner rush was indeed beginning, with several cars pulling into the parking lot and the phone ringing with what were likely takeout orders. Grace could feel the pressure of normal business operations pulling at Mario's attention, and she realized that whatever help Elena was going to receive would need to happen quickly or not at all. The restaurant couldn't afford to halt operations for an extended crisis, no matter how sympathetic the circumstances. Elena seemed to sense the mounting tension and began apologizing profusely, trying once again to leave rather than cause further disruption. Grace gently caught her arm, recognizing the moment as crucial. If Elena left now, she would likely end up sleeping in her car again with a hungry baby, possibly not finding another opportunity for help before her situation became truly desperate. Grace had heard enough stories from other refugees to know how quickly circumstances could deteriorate for people with no safety net. Mario made a decision that surprised Grace. He told Elena she could sit in the back booth and nurse her baby privately, and he offered to prepare a simple meal for her to pay for later. Grace translated this offer, watching Elena's face transform with gratitude and relief. However, Grace could also see the practical problems with this arrangement. Elena clearly had no money to pay later, and creating a debt she couldn't fulfill would only add to her burden of shame and obligation. The restaurant's pace was accelerating around them as the dinner crowd began arriving in earnest. Grace knew she needed to return to her tables, but she also couldn't abandon Elena to navigate this situation alone. The language barrier remained a significant obstacle, and Grace was the only person present who could bridge the gap between Elena's needs and the restaurant's capacity to help. She felt torn between her professional obligations and her moral convictions. Dr. Hayes suddenly stood up and walked toward them, his approach drawing attention from other customers who were beginning to sense that something significant was happening. Grace watched him carefully, unsure whether his intervention would help or complicate an already delicate situation. Elena shrank back slightly at the approach of this well-dressed stranger, her protective instincts activating in response to unexpected attention. Grace positioned herself between Elena and Dr. Hayes, ready to translate if necessary, but also prepared to deflect any unwanted interference. She learned to be cautious about well-meaning strangers whose help sometimes came with conditions or expectations that could make situations more complicated rather than better. Elena clutched her baby closer, her eyes darting between the doctor and the door as if calculating escape routes. The restaurant continued to fill with evening customers, and Grace could see Jennifer struggling to seat people and take orders without Grace's assistance. Mario kept glancing over at the developing situation while trying to manage the kitchen and coordinate the evening's service. The pressure of competing responsibilities weighed heavily on everyone involved, and Grace realized that whatever solution emerged would need to be both immediate and sustainable. Dr. Hayes reached them and spoke quietly to Grace, asking if he could help translate or if there was anything he could do to assist. His offer seemed genuine, but Grace remained cautious, knowing that Elena's vulnerable position made her susceptible to both help and exploitation. The baby began crying again, a sound that seemed to pierce through all other considerations and demand immediate attention to the most basic human needs. The situation began deteriorating rapidly as Elena's baby's cries intensified, drawing increasingly irritated glances from other customers throughout the restaurant. Grace watched the young mother's composure finally crack as exhaustion and desperation overwhelmed her ability to maintain control. Elena was trying unsuccessfully to calm her daughter while simultaneously apologizing to everyone around her. Her limited English mixed with rapid Spanish and what Grace now recognized as indigenous language from Central America. Two businessmen at table 4 called Jennifer over to complain about the noise, suggesting that the restaurant should handle its homeless problem more efficiently. Grace felt her jaw clench as she overheard their comments, but she forced herself to remain focused on Elena's immediate needs rather than responding to the casual cruelty of customers who viewed human suffering as an inconvenience to their dining experience. Mario was visibly struggling with the mounting pressure from multiple directions. The kitchen was backing up with orders. Jennifer was overwhelmed trying to cover Grace's tables, and now he had paying customers expressing dissatisfaction with the atmosphere. Grace could see him approaching what she recognized as a breaking point, where business necessity would override compassion regardless of his personal feelings about Elena's situation. Dr. Hayes attempted to help by speaking gently to Elena in broken Spanish, but his well-intentioned efforts only seemed to increase her agitation. Grace realized that Elena was beyond the point where words could provide comfort. She needed immediate, practical solutions to feed her baby and restore some sense of stability. The cultural and language barriers were becoming more apparent as stress levels rose, with good intentions failing to translate into effective communication. The baby's cries reached a pitch that seemed to reverberate through the entire restaurant, causing conversations to pause and creating an atmosphere of shared discomfort. Grace noticed several customers looking toward the door, as if considering whether to leave rather than endure the disruption. For a small restaurant operating on thin margins, losing customers during the crucial dinner rush could have lasting financial consequences that would affect everyone who worked there. Elena suddenly stood up from the booth where Mario had seated her, her movements quick and desperate as she headed toward the exit. Grace could see that the young mother had reached her emotional limit and was choosing flight over continuing to subject herself and her baby to public scrutiny. The pattern was one Grace recognized from her own family's experiences, the moment when pride and shame overcame desperate need, when suffering in private seemed preferable to accepting help that came with public humiliation. Grace found herself caught between multiple loyalties and responsibilities. Her tables were backing up, Mario needed her support during the busy dinner service, and other customers were beginning to look specifically at her, as if expecting her to resolve the situation that was disrupting their evening. At the same time, she couldn't bear to watch Elena leave without the help she desperately needed. Knowing that the young mother's options were extremely limited, and that her baby's welfare hung in the balance, Jennifer approached Grace with visible frustration, pointing out that table 7 was still waiting to order and that the couple at table 12 was asking specifically for Grace to take their order. Grace could see the resentment building in her coworker's expression, the feeling that Elena's crisis was somehow Grace's responsibility to resolve rather than a shared human situation requiring collective compassion. The division between staff members added another layer of tension to an already stressful situation. Mario made a decision that felt inevitable but devastating. He approached Alina and gently but firmly explained that she would need to take her baby outside if she couldn't quiet the crying. He offered to pack some food for her to take with her. But Grace could see that this compromise satisfied no one and solved nothing. Alina would still be homeless and struggling. The restaurant would lose the opportunity to genuinely help. And Grace would be left with the knowledge that institutional pressures had prevented meaningful assistance. Elena's face showed a mixture of gratitude for Mario's kindness and humiliation at being asked to leave. Grace watched her gather her few possessions while trying to soothe her increasingly distressed baby. And she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The careful professional distance she'd maintained throughout years of waitressing suddenly felt inadequate to address what she was witnessing. Her own history, her own understanding of desperation, demanded a more personal response. Dr. Hayes stepped forward again, this time pulling out his wallet and offering to pay for whatever food Elena needed. His gesture was generous but felt insufficient to address the broader crisis of a homeless teenager with a baby who had nowhere to go and no resources beyond the few dollars in her purse. Grace appreciated his willingness to help, but realized that the situation required more than a single meal or temporary financial assistance. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted completely from the usual comfortable buzz of dinner conversation to an uncomfortable tension where everyone was aware of the unresolved drama, but uncertain how to respond appropriately. Grace noticed customers whispering among themselves, some expressing sympathy for Elena's situation, while others maintained that the restaurant was not the appropriate place to address such problems. The division of opinions reflected broader social tensions about poverty, immigration, and communal responsibility. Grace watched Elena reach the door once again, and this time she knew that if the young mother left, she would disappear into the anonymous struggles of people who fell through social safety nets designed for different circumstances. The baby's cries seemed to echo with all the injustices Grace had witnessed and experienced, and she realized that her carefully maintained invisibility was no longer sustainable in the face of such immediate need. Grace made a decision that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. Setting down the order pad she'd been clutching, she walked directly to Elena and spoke to her in rapid Spanish, explaining that she was going to help regardless of what anyone else thought. Elena's eyes widened with surprise and relief, but also with the weariness of someone who'd learned that promises could be broken and that help often came with hidden costs or conditions she couldn't afford to meet. Without asking permission from Mario or explaining her actions to the watching customers, Grace guided Elena back to the corner booth furthest from the main dining area. She brought over a glass of ice water and quietly assured Elena that she could take as much time as she needed to nurse her baby privately. Grace positioned herself strategically to block the view from other tables, creating a small pocket of privacy in the public space. Dr. Hayes watched this interaction with growing interest, his business dinner apparently forgotten as he observed Grace's confident handling of the situation. Grace noticed him pulling out his phone not to make a call but to activate the camera function, though she was too focused on Elena's immediate needs to wonder about his intentions. The baby's cries had begun to subside as Elena started nursing, and Grace felt some of the tension in the restaurant begin to ease. Mario approached Grace with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing her compassionate instincts while also worrying about the precedent being set and the potential impact on other customers. Grace quickly explained her plan. She would use her own break time to sit with Elena, help translate any needs, and ensure the situation didn't disrupt normal restaurant operations. Her proposal represented a compromise that addressed both humanitarian and business concerns. Jennifer reluctantly agreed to cover Grace's tables temporarily, though her expression made it clear she viewed this as an unfair burden. Grace understood her coworker's frustration, but also recognized that the situation required flexibility and collective effort to resolve successfully. The other customers seemed reassured that normal service was resuming, even as they continued to cast curious glances toward the corner booth. Grace sat across from Elena, who was now nursing her baby more successfully in the quieter, more private environment. Through their conversation, Grace learned more about Elena's story. She was fleeing domestic violence, had been traveling with minimal resources, and was trying to reach relatives in a city several hundred miles away. Her baby daughter, Sophia, was healthy but understandably distressed by the instability and inadequate nutrition of their journey. As Elena became more comfortable, she revealed that she had been a nursing student in her home country before circumstances forced her to leave. Grace felt a connection deepen between them as she recognized Elena's intelligence and education, qualities that poverty and language barriers had temporarily obscured but hadn't erased. Grace shared carefully selected details of her own family's immigration experience, creating a bridge of understanding based on common struggles. Dr. Hayes continued to observe from his table, occasionally taking photos or video with his phone in a way that seemed documentarian rather than intrusive. Grace noticed his attention but remained focused on Elena's needs, helping her order a nutritious meal that would support her nursing and provide energy for continued travel. Grace used her own employee discount and tip money to cover the cost, a gesture that felt necessary rather than burdensome. The restaurant's dinner service continued around them, but with a different energy than usual. Grace noticed that several customers seemed moved by what they were witnessing. Even if they didn't fully understand the details, the simple act of providing space and dignity for a mother to feed her baby had transformed what began as a crisis into something more positive, demonstrating how small acts of kindness could reshape entire environments. Elena's baby finished nursing and settled into peaceful sleep, allowing Elena to eat her first proper meal in days. Grace watched the young mother's face transform as immediate stress gave way to cautious relief. Though she could see that Elena remained alert to potential threats or changes in the situation, trust was clearly something Elena had learned to ration carefully, dispensing it only when absolutely necessary for survival. Mario brought over additional food without being asked, including items suitable for Elena to take with her when she continued her journey. His gesture represented both kindness and practical wisdom, ensuring that Elena's immediate crisis was addressed while also acknowledging that the restaurant couldn't become a permanent solution to her homelessness. Grace appreciated his balanced approach to a complex situation. Dr. Hayes finally approached their table, introducing himself and asking if he could speak with them briefly. Grace remained cautious, but agreed to translate, curious about his intentions and hoping they were benevolent. Elena tensed slightly at the approach of this well-dressed stranger, but Grace's presence seemed to provide reassurance that the interaction would be safe and respectful. The doctor explained that he worked with organizations that helped refugees and asylum seekers, and that he might be able to connect Elena with resources in the city where she was headed. Grace translated this offer, watching Elena's expression carefully for signs of hope or suspicion. The possibility of legitimate help rather than charity felt different to Elena, more sustainable and less dependent on individual goodwill. Dr. Hayes revealed that he had been recording Elena's story with her permission, explaining that he was documenting real experiences of refugees for a presentation to potential donors and policymakers. Grace translated his request carefully, ensuring Elena understood both the opportunity and the implications of sharing her story publicly. Elena's response surprised Grace, despite her vulnerability. She wanted her experience documented if it might help other women in similar situations. As Dr. Hayes continued filming, Grace watched, Alina transformed from a desperate young mother into an articulate advocate for herself and others facing similar challenges. Speaking in Spanish with Grace translating, Alina described her journey with dignity and clarity, explaining the impossible choices that had led her to leave everything familiar in search of safety for herself and her daughter. Her intelligence and strength became evident as she shared her story. The other customers in the restaurant had gradually become aware that something significant was happening in the corner booth, rather than continuing to view Alina as a disruptive presence. Many began to understand they were witnessing something remarkable, a young woman's courage in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Grace noticed conversations at other tables shifting from complaint to curiosity to admiration. Dr. Hayes explained to Grace that he was the director of a nonprofit organization that provided comprehensive support for refugees, including temporary housing, legal assistance, job training, and educational opportunities. Elena's story was exactly the kind of real testimony he needed to demonstrate to donors how their contributions could make immediate, tangible differences in people's lives. Grace felt excitement building as she translated this information for Alina. The baby Sophia woke up refreshed and content. Her earlier distress completely resolved now that her basic needs had been met. Grace noticed how different Alina looked holding her peaceful daughter compared to the desperate woman who had entered the restaurant hours earlier. The transformation reminded Grace of her own family's journey from crisis to stability, though she knew Elena's path would likely be longer and more complex. Mario approached their table with obvious emotion, explaining that he and his wife had been refugees themselves 30 years earlier. He shared briefly how strangers' kindness had made the difference between survival and tragedy for his family, and he offered Elena a job in his restaurant if she ever returned to the area. Grace translated this offer, watching Elena's eyes fill with tears at the unexpected prospect of legitimate employment and community support. Jennifer, who had initially been frustrated by the disruption to normal service, brought over a bag of additional food and baby supplies that she had collected from other staff members. Her gesture represented a complete shift in perspective, from viewing Alina as a problem to be managed to recognizing her as a person deserving support. Grace felt proud of her coworkers' growth and ashamed of having underestimated her capacity for compassion. Dr. Hayes made several phone calls, arranging temporary housing for Alina in the city where she was headed and connecting her with CASE, workers who could help navigate legal and social services. Grace watched Elena's posture change as concrete help materialized, her defensive vigilance giving way to cautious hope. The transformation was remarkable, demonstrating how quickly circumstances could improve when the right resources and connections aligned. The other customers had gradually gathered information about Elena's situation through overheard conversations and observation, and several approached to offer additional help. Grace found herself coordinating a spontaneous support network, contact information, gas money, baby supplies, and encouragement from strangers who had been moved by witnessing Elena's story. The restaurant had become an impromptu community center focused on collective problem-solving. Grace realized that her own role had evolved far beyond waitressing into something closer to advocacy and interpretation. Her language skills, cultural understanding, and personal experience had made her uniquely qualified to bridge different worlds and facilitate connections that might not have occurred otherwise. The recognition felt both empowering and overwhelming, suggesting possibilities for her future that she hadn't previously considered. Dr. Hayes offered Grace a business card and suggested she contact him about potential opportunities with his organization. He had observed her natural skills in cultural mediation, crisis intervention, and community building, recognizing abilities that her current job barely utilized. Grace accepted the card while remaining focused on Elena's immediate needs, but she felt something shift in her understanding of her own potential. Elena stood to leave, now equipped with resources, connections, and hope that it hadn't existed when she first entered the restaurant. She hugged Grace tightly, expressing gratitude in multiple languages for kindness that had extended far beyond professional obligation into genuine human solidarity. Grace felt the emotional weight of their connection, knowing she had helped change the trajectory of Elena's and Sophia's lives. The restaurant gradually returned to normal operation, but with a different atmosphere than before. Customers lingered longer. Conversations were more animated, and there was a sense of shared accomplishment in having participated in something meaningful. Grace noticed that people looked at her differently now, with recognition and respect that acknowledged her crucial role in orchestrating Elena's rescue. Dr. Hayes spent the next hour uploading the video footage he had captured to his organization's social media platforms and donor network. The story of Elena's crisis and the restaurant community's response began circulating immediately, generating comments, shares, and expressions of support from around the country. Grace watched over his shoulder as the views and reactions multiplied, realizing that Elena's story was touching people far beyond their small community. By the next morning, the video had gone viral, attracting attention from local news stations, national advocacy organizations, and individuals wanting to contribute to Elena's continued support. Dr. Hayes contacted Grace to explain that donations were pouring in, specifically designated for Elena's assistance, and that several organizations were offering additional resources for her resettlement and education. Grace received a call at home offering her a full-time position with Dr. Hayes' organization, with responsibilities that would include cultural liaison work, crisis intervention, and public speaking about refugee experiences. The salary was nearly double what she earned, waitressing, and the position included health insurance and educational benefits that could allow her to complete her pre-med studies. Mario's restaurant experienced an unexpected surge in customers attracted by the positive publicity surrounding Elena's story. Local news coverage highlighted the restaurant's role in providing sanctuary and support, drawing community members who wanted to support a business that demonstrated such values. Grace found herself working busier shifts than ever, but with a completely different energy and purpose. Elena successfully reached her destination city and was welcomed by the comprehensive support network that Dr. Hayes had arranged. She sent Grace photos of the temporary apartment where she and Sophia were staying, along with information about the English classes and job training programs she had enrolled in. Her messages expressed ongoing gratitude but also growing confidence about her future prospects. Several other refugee families began visiting Mario's restaurant specifically because they had heard about Elena's positive experience there. Grace found herself serving as an informal cultural interpreter and resource coordinator, connecting people with services while ensuring they felt welcome and safe. Her language skills and personal understanding of the refugee experience made her uniquely valuable in this expanded role. Dr. Hayes arranged for Grace to speak at donor events and policy conferences, sharing her perspective on how individual acts of kindness could be systematized into effective community support networks. Grace discovered she had a talent for public speaking and for articulating complex social issues in ways that motivated action rather than just sympathy. Her presentations consistently resulted in increased donations and volunteer commitments. Grace's story began attracting attention from medical schools, several of which offered her scholarships and accelerated admission programs designed for students with significant life experience and demonstrated commitment to serving underserved populations. The recognition that her background was an asset rather than an obstacle felt revolutionary and opened possibilities she had thought were permanently closed. Elena completed her English proficiency requirements ahead of schedule and was accepted into a nursing program with full financial support from donors who had been moved by her story. She sent Grace her first essay assignment, written in careful English about the importance of healthcare providers who understood immigrant experiences. Grace felt pride in Elena's accomplishment and in the role their encounter had played in creating new opportunities. The restaurant became an unofficial community resource center, with Grace coordinating informal networks of support for refugees, immigrants, and other community members facing crises. Mario embraced this evolution, recognizing that his restaurant's reputation for compassion was actually good for business and consistent with his own values. Grace's expanded role came with increased responsibilities, but also with deep satisfaction. Dr. Hayes's organization received increased funding partly based on the compelling documentation of Elena's story and the demonstration of how quickly effective intervention could transform lives. The video had become a case study in successful crisis response, and Grace found herself consulting with other organizations about replicating their model in different communities. Grace accepted the position with Dr. Hayes's organization while continuing to work part-time at the restaurant, creating a bridge between her old life and new opportunities. She used her signing bonus to help Elena's family travel safely to join her in their new city, completing the reunion that Elena had been working toward throughout her dangerous journey. The cycle of support continued expanding, touching more lives with each connection. Elena graduated from nursing school with honors and was offered a position at the same medical center where Dr. Hayes worked. Her first day of work was covered by local media as an inspiring example of resilience and community support, with Grace present to witness Elena's transformation from desperate refugee to professional caregiver. The moment felt like completion of a circle that had begun with a hungry baby's cries in a small restaurant. Grace completed her pre-med requirements while working full-time in refugee services, discovering that her combination of personal experience, language skills, and clinical training made her exceptionally effective at providing culturally competent healthcare. She decided to specialize in family medicine, with a focus on immigrant and refugee populations, using her platform to advocate for policy changes that would prevent others from experiencing the crises she had witnessed. Years later, Grace would look back on the evening when Elena entered Mario's restaurant as the moment when her own life truly began, when she stopped merely surviving and started building the future she had always imagined. Her story became part of the training materials Dr. Hayes used with new volunteers, demonstrating how recognizing our common humanity can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities in ways that ripple outward far beyond what we can initially imagine.